No one spoke when the black Rolls-Royce stopped at the marble steps of the Santorini estate, not the security guards who had seen presidents tremble, not the bankers who controlled billions with a handshake, not even the billionaire himself who stood stiff beside the car like a boy awaiting judgment, because inside that vehicle sat the man who had built empires and destroyed them with silence alone, Alessandro De Luca's father. A legend whispered about in boardrooms and feared in bloodlines, a man whose presence sucked the air out of any room he entered, and as the door opened slowly the atmosphere tightened like a held breath, his cane touching stone first, then his polished shoe, his eyes cold and ancient as if they had already seen the future and found it disappointing, and every single person instinctively lowered their gaze because speaking to him without invitation was not just rude, it was dangerous. Yet among the perfectly dressed elite and trembling executives stood her. Unnoticed at first, a woman in a simple dress borrowed from a friend, hair tied back not for elegance but practicality. Her name was Sofia Romano and she had absolutely no idea that her life was about to split into a before and an after, because she wasn't supposed to be there, she was only a last-minute translator filling in for someone who fell sick, a nobody among titans. And as Alessandro's father stepped forward and surveyed the gathering like a general inspecting soldiers, his face hardened. Dissatisfaction written clearly, he spoke in Italian, low and sharp, criticizing the event, the people, even his own son without mercy, and no one responded, because although they understood the words, they were too afraid to answer, the silence growing heavier by the second, until Sophia felt something tighten in her chest, not fear but injustice, because she understood Italian not as a language but as a childhood lullaby, as a mother's whispered prayers, as her late grandfather's stories, and before her brain could catch up to her instincts, before anyone could stop her, she spoke, just one sentence, just one word first, soft but clear, aspetti, wait, the sound sliced through the silence like glass breaking, head snapped toward her, security stiffened, Alessandro froze. And for the first time in decades Alessandro De Luca's father looked surprised, his eyes locking onto Sofia with sharp intensity, the air crackling as he slowly turned to face her fully, measuring her like prey or possibility, and when she continued, politely, respectfully, but without fear, correcting a misunderstanding in flawless, old-school Italian, the kind only spoken by families who preserved language like heritage, the estate might as well have vanished because all that existed was that moment, a nobody standing her ground before the most feared man in the room, and instead of anger, something far more dangerous appeared on his face, interest. He asked her name, her origin, why her accent carried echoes of southern villages long forgotten, and Sophia answered honestly, unaware that honesty was the one thing money could never buy. And as the crowd watched history bend slightly off course, Alessandro felt something shift inside him too, because for the first time he saw his father not dominate a room, but listen, and as the old man smiled faintly, not kindly but knowingly, he said a sentence that would haunt Sophia long after the night ended, La lingua rivela il sang, language reveals blood, and with that, he invited her to walk beside him, leaving whispers, envy, and shock in their wake. And as they disappeared into the villa's shadowed halls, one truth settled heavy over everyone left behind: this woman had just stepped into a world where power doesn't forgive mistakes, and whatever had drawn the old lion's attention never let go easily. And if you think this is where the story peaks, trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. Make sure you subscribe now, because what happens next will change everything. The villa corridors swallowed Sophia in silence as Alessandro De Luca's father walked ahead of her, his cane echoing softly against ancient stone like a metronome measuring courage, and with every step her heart pounded harder because she could feel it now. This was no compliment, no coincidence, no harmless curiosity, this was examination, the kind that decided futures. And when they reached a private study overlooking the sea, a room lined with books older than most companies in the world, the old man finally turned, his gaze sharp enough to peel layers from a soul, and he spoke again in Italian, slowly, deliberately, asking questions that sounded casual but were anything but, about her family, her grandparents, her childhood, and Sophia answered truthfully, explaining how her nana had fled Italy decades ago with nothing but recipes, prayers, and a fierce refusal to forget who she was. How Italian wasn't learned but lived, how every word carried memory, and as she spoke, the Billionaire patriarch's expression changed subtly, not softened but focused, as if pieces of a puzzle long abandoned were suddenly sliding back into place, because what Sophia didn't know was that Alessandro's father had been searching for something for years, proof that bloodlines could scatter but never disappear, and when he asked her one final question, the name of her grandfather, the room fell still, and the moment Sophia spoke it, the old man's hand tightened around his cane, his eyes darkening with something dangerously close to emotion, because that name was buried deep in his past, tied to betrayal, exile, and a family fracture powerful enough to reshape an empire, and at that exact moment Alessandro burst into the room, tension radiating from him, demanding to know what was happening, but his father silenced him with a raised hand, something he hadn't done in years, and declared that Sophia was no longer a guest but a responsibility, a sentence that landed like thunder, because in their world responsibility meant protection, control, and ownership all wrapped into one, and Sophia felt the weight of invisible chains settle around her even as opportunities glittered before her eyes. As days passed she was drawn deeper into their orbit, invited to dinners where words were weapons and smiles hid calculations, overhearing conversations about mergers and enemies, learning that the De Luca Empire was not built on money alone but on secrets, sacrifices, and silence, and through it all, Alessandro watched her, conflicted, drawn to her sincerity yet afraid of what her presence was awakening in his father, because the old man was changing, questioning decisions, reopening old accounts, summoning lawyers, hinting at a truth that could shatter the family hierarchy, and when Sophia finally discovered the reason, when she overheard the words, legitimate blood, spoken behind closed doors, she realized with chilling clarity that she wasn't just a translator who spoke one Italian word at the wrong time. She was a living threat to everything this dynasty believed was secure, and when Alessandro confronted his father, demanding answers, the old man delivered the truth without mercy, that Sophia's grandfather had been cast out to protect the empire, that blood had been denied for convenience, and that now fate had returned the debt with interest, and as Sophia stood between father and son, caught in a storm of power, legacy, and identity, she had to choose whether to walk away and remain invisible or step fully into a world that could elevate her or destroy her completely, and as the chapter closed with her standing alone on the terrace, staring at the endless sea, realizing that one word had rewritten her destiny forever, one truth became undeniable: some stories don't begin when you're ready, they begin when silence is broken.